In the early, misty morning hours of October 25, 1944, the supreme commanders of the Imperial Japanese Navy were completely, arrogantly convinced that absolute victory was finally within their grasp. A massive, incredibly terrifying armada of Japanese warships, known as the Center Force, had silently slipped through the dark, treacherous San Bernardino Strait in the Philippines. At the very heart of this unstoppable mechanical leviathan was the Yamato. It was the single largest, most heavily armored and utterly devastating super-battleship ever completely constructed in the history of human warfare. Looking through the massive optical rangefinders, the highly confident Japanese Admiral Admiral Kurita spotted a fleet of American ships desperately fleeing on the horizon. He genuinely, completely believed he had successfully ambushed the pride of the United States Pacific Fleet. He smiled, ordering his massive 18-inch naval guns to violently open fire, completely expecting an absolute blood-soaked massacre of the American forces. But the arrogant Japanese admiral had made a massive, deeply fatal miscalculation. He had not found the heavy American fleet carriers or the massive U.S. battleships. He had stumbled upon Taffy III, a tiny, heavily outgunned and completely unarmored American task unit consisting of slow escort carriers and a few tiny destroyers. By all absolute mathematical logic of naval warfare, the American sailors were entirely doomed to be violently slaughtered and sent to the dark bottom of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese possessed an overwhelming, completely inescapable advantage in heavy armor, blinding speed, and terrifying firepower. But the elite Japanese commanders completely failed to understand the absolute, unyielding savagery of the American sailor when backed into a blood-soaked corner. Instead of completely surrendering or dying quietly in the water, the commanders of the tiny American destroyers, affectionately known as tin cans, made a deeply terrifying, entirely suicidal decision. Led by the incredibly aggressive Commander Ernest Evans aboard the USS Johnston, the unarmored American ships violently turned their bows directly toward the massive Japanese armada. They aggressively charged the greatest battleship fleet ever assembled, completely willing to drown the Imperial Japanese Navy in a chaotic, blinding storm of American steel and blood. To entirely comprehend the absolute, blood-soaked insanity of what transpired off the coast of the Philippines on October 25, 1944. We must first look at the deeply terrifying, entirely unbridgeable gap in military firepower between the two opposing fleets. The American task unit, officially designated as Taffy III, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. It was absolutely not a heavily armored combat fleet designed to stand toe-to-toe with enemy warships in a brutal surface engagement. It was comprised of 6 slow, incredibly fragile escort carriers, commonly referred to as baby flattops. These converted civilian cargo ships were protected by a tiny, heavily outgunned screen of just 3 destroyers and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. The American sailors grimly, cynically joked that the official Navy designation for their escort carriers, CVE, actually stood for combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. They were armed with absolute paper-thin armor that could barely stop a heavy machine gun bullet, let alone a massive, high-explosive naval artillery shell. Their primary, deeply unglamorous mission was simply to hunt for enemy submarines and provide close air support for the American infantry landing on the beaches of Leyte. As the sun slowly rose on that misty, deeply deceptive morning, the American sailors were drinking their terrible Navy coffee, expecting another quiet, entirely routine day of combat patrols. But suddenly, the highly sensitive American radar operators, staring at their glowing green screens, reported massive, entirely unidentified surface contacts rapidly approaching from the north. A few terrifying minutes later, an American pilot flying a routine anti-submarine patrol desperately keyed his radio microphone in absolute screaming panic. He frantically reported that the massive, legendary center force of the Imperial Japanese Navy had magically, inexplicably broken through the American lines. Admiral Sprague, standing on the unarmored bridge of his tiny escort carrier, initially completely refused to believe the terrified pilot's report. He assumed the young aviator had simply misidentified a friendly American battleship task force. But then, the deep, heavy morning mist on the ocean horizon slowly, violently began to lift, and the deeply exhausted, completely unprotected American sailors looked out across the dark water and witnessed an absolute, heart-stopping nightmare. Rising ominously over the curvature of the earth were the distinct, terrifyingly massive pagoda masts of the Imperial Japanese heavy fleet. It was an unstoppable, massively armored wall of Japanese steel aggressively bearing down directly upon them. The terrifying Japanese armada consisted of 4 massive battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 heavily armed destroyers. And leading this apocalyptic mechanical death fleet was the terrifying, undeniable silhouette of the super-battleship Yamato. Displacing an absolutely staggering 72,000 tons of heavily forged Krupp-style steel, the Yamato was a mechanical monster of unprecedented, terrifying proportions. It was heavily armed with 9 massive, incredibly devastating 18.1-inch naval guns. A single, high-explosive artillery shell fired from the Yamato weighed exactly as much as an entire American fighter plane. The deeply arrogant Japanese Admiral Takeo Kurita looked through his heavy optical rangefinders and smiled a cold, highly triumphant smile. He looked at the tiny, slow-moving American escort carriers and entirely assumed he had caught the massive, elite fleet carriers of the U.S. Navy completely by surprise. He confidently, arrogantly ordered his entire massive armada to open fire, fully expecting the American fleet to violently disintegrate in a matter of minutes. The terrifying, deafening roar of the massive Japanese naval guns violently shattered the quiet morning air. Massive, earth-shattering columns of violently dyed water, red, green, and pink, began exploding terrifyingly close to the fragile American hulls. The Japanese deliberately dyed their heavy artillery shells so each massive battleship could accurately track its own horrific destruction. For the young, terrified American sailors standing on the exposed, unarmored decks of Taffy 3, the psychological terror was absolute and entirely paralyzing. They were trapped in incredibly slow, unarmored ships, aggressively hunted by the fastest, most heavily armed mechanical monsters on the planet. Mathematical logic strictly dictated that every single American sailor was about to be violently, mercilessly slaughtered and sent to the dark, freezing bottom of the Pacific Ocean. But the arrogant Japanese commanders were about to violently discover that when you back the United States Navy into a hopeless, blood-soaked corner, they do not simply lay down and die. As the terrifying, massive geysers of violently colored water erupted all around the incredibly fragile American escort carriers, the situation devolved into absolute, paralyzing chaos. Admiral Sprague desperately ordered his slow, vulnerable baby Flattops to immediately turn and run, plunging into a nearby rain squall to desperately hide from the overwhelming Japanese guns. He ordered his tiny, unarmored destroyers to aggressively lay down a thick, heavy smokescreen, hoping to blindly obscure the retreating American carriers. But aboard the tiny 2,100-ton American destroyer, the USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans was not a man who simply hid behind a wall of smoke. Evans was an incredibly fierce, deeply intense man of Native American Cherokee descent, and he possessed an absolute, terrifyingly aggressive fighting spirit. When he had first taken command of the incredibly small, unarmored Johnston, he had famously, aggressively promised his crew that he would never run from a fight. Looking through his binoculars at the massive, unstoppable wall of heavily armored Japanese steel bearing down on his completely doomed fleet, Evans made his legendary decision. He did not wait for a direct order from the deeply panicked American command. He immediately, violently ordered his helmsman to completely break formation, aggressively turning the tiny bow of the Johnston directly toward the massive Japanese armada. Evans violently slammed the engine telegraph to absolute maximum flank speed, pushing the small American destroyer to a terrifyingly fast 34 knots. The tiny, completely unarmored American tin can was aggressively, suicidally charging alone directly into the heavy guns of 4 massive battleships and over a dozen heavily armed cruisers. Aboard the pristine, massive bridges of the Japanese heavy cruisers, the highly arrogant Japanese commanders simply could not mathematically process what they were witnessing. They looked through their advanced crystal optics in absolute paralyzing disbelief as a single, entirely insignificant American destroyer violently charged their invincible fleet. They entirely assumed it was a completely panicked, highly irrational mistake made by a deeply terrified, inexperienced American captain. But Evans was aggressively, brilliantly calculating a highly complex, absolutely suicidal torpedo firing solution. To successfully fire his 10 heavy torpedoes, Evans had to violently drive his unarmored ship to within just 5 miles of the heavy Japanese guns. For an incredibly agonizing, deeply terrifying 20 minutes, the tiny USS Johnston violently zigzagged through a literal blinding storm of massive, high-explosive artillery shells. The terrifying roar of the massive Japanese 14-inch and 18-inch guns physically violently shook the small American destroyer as massive shells aggressively plunged into the ocean all around them. Incredibly, entirely through the sheer, miraculous skill of Commander Evans's aggressive maneuvering, the tiny Johnston miraculously survived the brutal gauntlet of heavy fire. When they finally, violently closed the distance to extreme point-blank range, Evans aggressively targeted the massive, heavily armored Japanese heavy cruiser, the Kumano. The American gunners violently opened fire with their fast-firing, completely insignificant 5-inch guns, aggressively scoring massive, completely unexpected direct hits on the pristine Japanese superstructure. The Japanese commanders were violently, entirely humiliated, completely furious that this tiny, annoying American insect was aggressively damaging their heavy armor. And then, Commander Evans violently gave the order that permanently cemented the USS Johnston into the absolute highest echelons of naval legend. He ordered the aggressive, immediate launch of all 10 heavy American torpedoes directly at the massive Japanese battle line. The heavy, deadly metal cylinders violently splashed into the dark ocean water, their aggressive, high-speed propellers leaving thick, white wakes as they armed and tracked their target. Evans immediately violently ordered his tiny ship to execute a massive, hard turn, desperately trying to escape the absolute, inescapable hellfire that was about to rain down upon them. Aboard the massive Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, the arrogant commanders suddenly violently realized the absolute terrifying reality of the American suicide charge. They desperately, frantically attempted to turn their massive, heavily armored ship, but they were incredibly, fatally too slow. At least one, and possibly three, massive American high-explosive torpedoes violently, aggressively slammed directly into the steel bow of the giant Japanese cruiser. The ensuing earth-shattering explosion violently, completely ripped the entire massive steel bow completely off the Japanese ship. The heavily armored, invincible Japanese mechanical monster was violently, entirely crippled, instantly forced to aggressively, completely withdraw from the entire battle. The absolute, entirely humiliating shock that violently rippled through the arrogant Japanese high command was profound and completely terrifying. A single, entirely unarmored American tin can had just aggressively, violently broken the heavy battle line of the most powerful surface fleet on the entire planet. But the absolute terrifying price for this aggressive, blood-soaked American arrogance was exacted almost immediately. The deeply furious, highly humiliated Japanese commanders violently turned the massive 18-inch guns of the super-battleship Yamato directly onto the fleeing USS Johnston. The massive, completely inescapable Japanese artillery shells violently, aggressively slammed directly into the tiny, unarmored American destroyer. The horrific, earth-shattering impacts violently ripped entirely through the thin American steel, causing massive, catastrophic damage to the engine rooms and violently slaughtering dozens of American sailors. Commander Ernest Evans was violently, aggressively blown completely off his feet, his shirt entirely ripped from his back, completely covered in dark blood and freezing ocean water. He was missing 2 fingers from his left hand, and his tiny, heavily damaged ship was violently burning, rapidly losing heavy engine power, and deeply surrounded by massive, angry Japanese monsters. Mathematical logic absolutely dictated that the brutal, blood-soaked fight of the USS Johnston was entirely, permanently over. But covered in his own blood, standing violently amidst the burning, smoking ruins of his shattered bridge, Commander Evans absolutely refused to surrender. The deeply horrifying, completely unbelievable sight of the tiny USS Johnston violently charging the entire Imperial Japanese Navy alone completely shattered the paralyzing fear gripping the American fleet. Aboard the other completely unarmored, deeply vulnerable American destroyers of Taffy 3, the terrified commanders witnessed Commander Evans violently sail directly into the jaws of absolute mechanical death. And instead of simply retreating into the blinding white smoke, they were entirely, aggressively consumed by an absolute, blood-soaked, contagious fury. The massive, highly arrogant Japanese commanders, deeply furious over the humiliating torpedo hit on their heavy cruiser, completely expected the remaining American ships to scatter in sheer terror. They arrogantly assumed the completely suicidal Johnston was merely a highly isolated, deeply irrational anomaly. But as the deafening, earth-shattering roar of massive Japanese artillery completely filled the morning air, the heavy Japanese lookouts screamed in absolute paralyzing disbelief. The completely unarmored American destroyer USS Hole, violently rapidly followed by the USS Heermann, aggressively turned their tiny bows completely around. They violently slammed their engine telegraphs to maximum flank speed, entirely abandoning the highly defensive protective screen around the retreating American baby Flattops. They aggressively, violently launched themselves directly into the massive, terrifying wall of impenetrable Japanese Krupp steel. And deeply embedded within this entirely suicidal American charge was the absolute smallest, most heavily outgunned vessel on the entire freezing battlefield. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was not even a standard full-sized destroyer. It was a completely insignificant, painfully slow destroyer escort, completely lacking the heavy torpedo tubes and the heavy guns needed for a massive surface engagement. But its deeply fierce, incredibly aggressive commander, Robert Copeland, entirely refused to simply abandon the other American destroyers to a horrific, blood-soaked slaughter. He violently grabbed the ship's public address microphone, heavily addressing his deeply terrified, incredibly young crew. He grimly, aggressively informed them that they were entering an absolute, entirely inescapable fight against overwhelming, completely massive odds from which survival was mathematically impossible. But they were absolutely going to violently do their duty, and they were going to aggressively make the arrogant Japanese Empire pay a horrific, blood-soaked price for every single inch of the ocean. The tiny, insignificant Samuel B. Roberts violently charged directly toward the massive, heavily armored Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai. The American commanders were brilliantly, aggressively exploiting a massive, entirely fatal flaw in the arrogant Japanese mechanical design. The incredibly massive, heavily engineered Japanese 14-inch and 18-inch naval guns were strictly designed to violently destroy heavily armored enemy battleships at extreme, horizon-level distances. Because the tiny American destroyers aggressively charged so terrifyingly close to the massive Japanese hulls, the heavy Japanese guns, physically, mechanically, could not depress low enough to actually hit them. The massive, terrifying Japanese artillery shells simply violently screamed harmlessly over the tall, unarmored masts of the American tin cans. And when the massive Japanese guns did manage to violently score a direct, earth-shattering hit on the fragile American hulls, an entirely unbelievable, completely miraculous phenomenon violently occurred. The highly arrogant Japanese commanders had exclusively loaded their massive naval guns with completely devastating, heavily forged, armor-piercing artillery shells. These massive, heavy shells were entirely designed to violently detonate only after heavily punching through 2 feet of solid steel battleship armor. But the tiny, completely insignificant American destroyers were built with incredibly thin, completely unarmored steel plating. The massive, terrifying Japanese armor-piercing shells would violently punch a clean, entirely unexploded hole straight through the side of the American ship, completely passing through the empty air, and violently splashing harmlessly into the ocean on the other side. The incredibly arrogant, highly complex Japanese engineering was completely, violently failing them against the absolute, unyielding desperation of the American tin cans. At extremely point-blank range, the tiny American destroyers aggressively unleashed an absolute, completely blinding hellstorm of 5-inch artillery fire. The highly determined, completely exhausted American gun crews on the Samuel B. Roberts furiously, violently loaded and fired their tiny guns so incredibly fast that the heavy metal barrels literally began to physically melt. They aggressively, violently scored massive, devastating hits, completely tearing through the unarmored, highly complex superstructures of the massive Japanese heavy cruisers. They violently shattered the heavy crystal optics, completely obliterated the Japanese command bridges, and violently slaughtered the arrogant Japanese officers standing exposed on the upper decks. Inside the pristine, highly protected command bridge of the massive super-battleship Yamato, Admiral Kurita was rapidly losing his absolute, arrogant grip on reality. He was staring out at a completely terrifying, highly chaotic battlefield filled with incredibly thick, blinding white smoke, violently burning ships, and completely unpredictable American aggression. he entirely, fundamentally, could not mathematically comprehend the absolute suicidal ferocity of the American attack. His deeply panicked, heavily exhausted brain completely refused to believe that he was violently fighting a tiny, completely insignificant handful of unarmored destroyers. He completely, genuinely believed that these aggressively fast, highly violent American ships were massive, heavily armored American heavy cruisers. He deeply, terrifiedly believed that the completely disorganized, highly aggressive American baby Flattops hiding in the heavy smoke were the massive, fully armed elite fleet carriers of the United States Navy. The incredibly massive, totally unstoppable Japanese center force was violently, aggressively being mentally broken by the absolute, entirely suicidal bravery of a few hundred completely desperate American farm boys. The heavily armored, completely invincible Japanese fleet was violently bleeding out in the dark Philippine Sea, completely surrounded by a highly aggressive, deeply terrifying American swarm that simply refused to die, while the completely unarmored American tin cans were violently, aggressively bleeding out in the freezing ocean, throwing their tiny bodies against the massive Japanese battle line. The deeply terrified, highly exhausted American sailors aboard the fleeing baby Flattops were desperately fighting an entirely different, highly chaotic war of survival. Admiral Clifton Sprague violently ordered every single operational American aircraft to immediately launch from the short, violently pitching wooden flight decks of the escort carriers. He aggressively ordered the heavy Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers and the nimble FM-2 Wildcat fighters to violently attack the massive Japanese armada with absolutely anything they had. But there was a massive, completely terrifying logistical reality that the desperate American pilots had to immediately violently confront. Because Taffy 3 was strictly designated to support the soft American infantry landings on the distant beaches of Leyte, the American aircraft were entirely, completely armed with the absolutely wrong, highly inappropriate ordnance for a massive, heavy naval surface engagement. Deep inside the dark, cramped magazines of the baby Flattops, there were absolutely no heavy, armor-piercing naval bombs capable of violently penetrating heavy Krupp steel. The young, deeply exhausted American armorers furiously, violently strapped highly explosive anti-personnel fragmentation bombs and completely useless anti-submarine depth charges to the wings of the Avengers. The highly aggressive American pilots entirely understood that dropping a soft fragmentation bomb onto the massive 18-inch thick steel turret of the Yamato was mathematically absolutely useless. It was exactly like violently throwing a small, fragile water balloon at a massive, heavily armored bank vault. But the deeply determined American aviators violently slammed their heavy throttles forward anyway, aggressively launching their massive radial engines into the dark, smoke-filled morning sky. They aggressively formed up into completely massive, highly disorganized swarms of angry American metal, violently diving out of the thick rain squalls directly onto the invincible Japanese fleet. The arrogant Japanese lookouts, standing highly exposed on the massive, towering pagoda masts, looked up and screamed in absolute terrifying panic. The sky was completely, violently filled with hundreds of highly aggressive American aircraft, mercilessly swarming the pristine Japanese battleships like a massive hive of deeply angry hornets. The American pilots violently, aggressively ignored the completely devastating, deafening wall of heavy Japanese anti-aircraft fire tearing through the dark sky. They aggressively dropped their completely useless fragmentation bombs and depth charges directly onto the massive, heavily armored Japanese superstructures. Just as mathematically expected, the massive, highly explosive American ordnance simply violently detonated entirely harmlessly against the thick, impenetrable Japanese steel. They completely failed to physically sink the massive Japanese monsters, but the American pilots were brilliantly, aggressively achieving an entirely different, massively devastating psychological victory. The incredibly arrogant, highly organized Japanese center force was violently, aggressively being thrown into complete, paralyzing tactical chaos. The massive Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers were violently forced to aggressively break their incredibly strict, highly defensive battle formations to desperately avoid the incoming American bombs. The massive, terrifying super-battleship Yamato was violently, aggressively forced to turn hard to port, completely taking its massive 18-inch guns entirely out of the brutal fight. The American pilots violently realized that their completely relentless, entirely aggressive presence was mathematically enough to deeply terrify the arrogant Japanese commanders. And when the heavy American Avengers and Wildcats completely ran out of their entirely useless bombs and machine gun ammunition, they did not simply return to their fleeing carriers. Instead, the incredibly desperate, completely fearless American aviators violently executed one of the most unbelievable, highly aggressive psychological tactics in naval aviation history. They aggressively pushed their massive aircraft into terrifyingly steep, high-speed dives directly at the massive Japanese command bridges. They violently screamed down toward the heavily armored Japanese ships, entirely unarmed, executing massive, terrifying, dry runs against the panicked enemy. The highly arrogant Japanese commanders, staring up in absolute paralyzing horror, violently threw their massive ships into violent, highly evasive maneuvers, deeply convinced they were about to be violently obliterated by heavy American torpedoes. They completely, genuinely believed they were fighting the massive, fully loaded elite fleet carriers of the United States Navy, not a highly desperate, completely unarmed swarm of baby Flattops. The absolute mind-breaking climax of this blood-soaked American aerial arrogance occurred high above the massive, terrifying bridge of a Japanese heavy cruiser. A deeply exhausted, incredibly aggressive American Wildcat pilot, having completely exhausted every single round of his heavy .50 caliber machine gun ammunition, violently dove his plane right down to the enemy deck. He aggressively slid open the heavy glass canopy of his roaring fighter plane, intensely feeling the violent, freezing wind violently whipping across his sweaty face. He violently pulled his standard-issue, completely insignificant .38 caliber service revolver from his leather shoulder holster. As he aggressively flew his massive aircraft mere feet above the heads of the deeply terrified Japanese officers, he violently leaned out the window and aggressively fired his tiny handgun directly at the massive, heavily armored Japanese battleship. It was an act of completely pure, unadulterated, absolute American defiance that profoundly, deeply shattered the mental resolve of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The arrogant Japanese Admiral Kurita, standing deeply terrified amidst the violent burning chaos on the bridge of the Yamato, was completely, entirely broken by the sheer insanity of the American swarm. He completely, genuinely, could not mathematically comprehend a military force that simply refused to surrender when completely faced with absolute, highly certain mechanical death. The massive, terrifying, invincible Japanese center force was aggressively, violently bleeding out, entirely paralyzed by the absolute, completely suicidal ferocity of the American Ghost Fleet. The absolute blood-soaked climax of the Battle of Samar was not defined by a massive, world-ending exchange of heavy battleship artillery. It was entirely, permanently defined by the absolute psychological collapse of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Admiral Kurita, standing highly protected inside the massive, heavily armored command center of the super-battleship Yamato, was a completely broken man. The incredibly arrogant, highly experienced Japanese commander simply could not mathematically or logically process the terrifying, unyielding violence unfolding across the dark Philippine Sea. He looked out through the thick, blinding chemical smoke and completely, genuinely believed he was aggressively fighting for his life against the entire, massively armored United States Pacific Fleet. His deeply exhausted, highly panicked brain completely convinced him that the tiny, unarmored American destroyers suicidally charging his battleships were massive, heavy cruisers. He absolutely believed that the aggressive, disorganized swarms of unarmed American baby Flattops were actually the massive, heavily protected elite fleet carriers of the U.S. Navy. The completely suicidal, highly aggressive American death swarm had violently, entirely shattered the Japanese tactical reality. At 09:11 hours, facing what he deeply, terrifiedly believed was absolute, inescapable annihilation, the arrogant Japanese admiral made a completely humiliating, history-altering decision. He violently grabbed the heavy brass communication microphone and aggressively issued a single, completely devastating order to his massive center force. "Cease action! Come north with me!" The absolute, unmitigated shock of that cowardly order violently rippled through the deeply confused Japanese fleet. The massive, terrifying super-battleship Yamato, the single most powerful, heavily armored warship entirely constructed in human history, violently turned its massive steel bow away from the fight. The invincible, highly arrogant Japanese armada aggressively, humiliatingly retreated from a tiny, completely unarmored handful of burning American tin cans and baby Flattops. The terrified, heavily exhausted American sailors, standing on the violently smoking, deeply shattered decks of Taffy, watched in absolute, completely paralyzed disbelief. The massive, terrifying pagoda masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy were slowly, entirely disappearing back over the dark ocean horizon. But the absolute terrifying cost of this miraculous, blood-soaked American victory was profoundly, deeply horrific. The dark, churning waters of the Pacific Ocean were completely violently filled with thick, burning aviation fuel, heavily twisted scrap metal, and hundreds of young American sailors. The incredibly aggressive, violently fearless USS Johnston, having entirely sacrificed its tiny steel body to aggressively break the Japanese battle line, had violently slipped beneath the freezing waves. Commander Ernest Evans, the deeply heroic, fiercely aggressive Native American warrior who absolutely refused to run, was never seen again. The completely insignificant, painfully slow destroyer escort, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the tiny ship that violently fought like a massive battleship, had violently burned to the waterline and sunk. The aggressively brave USS Hoel, violently torn entirely to shreds by massive, heavy Japanese armor-piercing shells, rested permanently in the dark, suffocating depths of the Philippine Sea. Over 1,000 deeply courageous, entirely unyielding American sailors and aviators were violently killed or heavily wounded in the freezing, chaotic water. But their absolute, suicidal, highly aggressive sacrifice was not entirely in vain. By violently throwing their unarmored, tiny ships directly into the terrifying jaws of the Japanese mechanical monster, They had absolutely, entirely saved the massive American amphibious invasion force. Tens of thousands of completely soft, highly vulnerable American infantrymen landing on the bloody beaches of Leyte were entirely completely spared from the devastating massive bombardment of the Yamato's 18-inch guns. The deeply arrogant, heavily indoctrinated Japanese high command had fundamentally, fatally failed to understand the terrifying, brutal reality of the American sailor. They completely, genuinely believed that superior, massive mechanical engineering and incredibly thick Krupp steel would effortlessly shatter the psychological resolve of the soft American youth. Instead, the United States Navy aggressively absorbed the massive, terrifying blow of the greatest battleship fleet ever assembled, radically adapted to the blinding chaos, and violently broke the Japanese spirit. They brilliantly, aggressively demonstrated to the entire world that a heavily armored, invincible machine is completely, entirely useless if the men fighting inside the supposedly inferior ships are absolutely willing to die to destroy you. Today, the incredibly deep, dark waters of the Philippine Sea remain a quiet, completely peaceful, and vast expanse of freezing ocean. But heavily entombed in the crushing, suffocating depths of the ocean floor lie the shattered, completely violently torn remains of the American tin cans. They silently stand as a permanent, incredibly stark, and deeply terrifying monument to the absolute fatal arrogance of underestimating the blood-soaked, aggressive resilience of the American military. Thank you so incredibly much for joining us on this deep, horrifying, and incredibly visceral dive into the absolute darkest, most terrifying realities of naval warfare in the Pacific. If you truly deeply enjoyed this massive, feature-length historical journey into the brutal, chaotic ocean and the screaming, burning steel of the Second World War, you absolutely must do us a massive favor right now. Violently, aggressively destroy that like button down below until it is completely, entirely unrecognizable. It massively, aggressively feeds the YouTube algorithm, entirely allowing us to continue actively producing these incredibly deep, terrifyingly detailed military documentaries for you every single week. You absolutely must hit that subscribe button right now and violently ring the notification bell, ensuring you are instantly, immediately deployed with us when our next massive historical deep dive violently goes live. We are aggressively, actively building the absolute greatest, most completely terrifying library of untold military history on this entire platform. And you absolutely cannot afford to miss a single blood-soaked episode. And before you finally safely climb down from the burning, shattered bridge of this video, we absolutely need to hear your direct, heavy orders down in the comments section below. What highly specific, deeply terrifying military engagement, legendary forgotten weapon system, or absolute blood-soaked campaign should we violently dissect and completely uncover in our next massive episode? Should we aggressively return to the freezing, muddy trenches of Europe, or violently storm the incredibly bloody, heavily fortified islands of the Pacific theater? Your direct, highly aggressive comments directly dictate the absolute future and the exact, precise tactical direction of this entire channel, so sound off immediately and let us know exactly where we should deploy our heavy fleet next. Until then, always entirely respect the terrifying history, stay incredibly deeply curious, and we will absolutely violently see you on the next battlefield.